Hello, my name is Emily and I work at Emory University in Atlanta in the United States. In this presentation, we'll look at the potential impact pathways of an orange flesh sweet potato project in southern Ethiopia on complementary feeding. The name of the project is Quality Diets for Better Health, and its implementation is led by the International Potato Center. There are two potential pathways by which the project could achieve its objective of improved diets for infants and young children. The first is a food security pathway, which the project aims to improve by promoting and supporting the adoption of vitamin A-rich orange flesh sweet potatoes, or OFSP. And the second pathway is a caregiver's ability or knowledge of complementary feeding, which the project aims to improve through community-based nutrition education. The project also tests the added benefit of a feeding toolkit pictured here. This toolkit includes a feeding bowl with demarcations to show age-appropriate portion sizes and a slotted spoon that promotes thicker consistency complementary foods. The project is evaluated by a cluster randomized control trial with a control group that did not receive any aspect of the intervention until after the end-line assessment. There is a partial intervention group that receives supports for community-based nutrition education and OFSP adoption, and a full intervention group that is similar to the partial intervention, but in addition to nutrition education and OFSP, receives the feeding toolkit. 605 households with infants under 6 months were enrolled in a longitudinal cohort and completed a baseline survey. A midline survey was then completed about 7 months later, and notably this was during the food insecure season, and then an inline survey which was about 13 months after the baseline survey. To assess the impact of the project and look at the impact pathways, we use the model indirect command in M+, which gives total, direct, and indirect effects. And we looked at two potential mediators. The first is caregivers' knowledge, for which we developed a knowledge score based on caregivers' responses to questions about complementary feeding and vitamin A. And the second is a household food security, which we measured via the food insecurity experience scale. For our outcomes, we computed a complementary feeding index, which ranged from 0 to 8 points and was based on individual indicators of minimum meal frequency, dietary diversity score, portion size, and complementary food thickness. This table shows some basic baseline descriptives, and I won't go over the whole table. I'll just point out that children at baseline were about 2.5 to 3 months of age, that agriculture was the primary form of employment for a majority of heads of household, and that less than half of caregivers had completed grade 4. The graphs on this slide show the raw complementary feeding outcomes at midline and inline. In the interest of time, I won't go over each one, but I'll focus on the summary complementary feeding index, which is on the right side. And here we see a sort of dose-response relationship, where the full intervention has the highest score at midline, and then the partial intervention is sort of halfway between the full intervention and the control. However, at inline, the partial intervention and control groups improved, while the full intervention stayed more or less the same. Looking at the impact evaluation, at midline, there were significant effects of both partial and full intervention on nutrition knowledge and household food security. However, only the improved knowledge was associated with improved complementary feeding index, meaning that there was a significant indirect effect of the partial and full intervention on the complementary feeding index. And this amounted to a beta of 0.13 and 0.16 for partial and full intervention. However, in addition to the indirect effect, there was a significant and strong direct effect of the full intervention on the complementary feeding index. And this direct effect was not mediated or explained by either caregiver nutrition knowledge or food security as they were measured. And the magnitude of this direct effect is about 0.5. And so compared to the indirect effects, it's a fair bit stronger. At inline, we still see a significant indirect effect of the project on complementary feeding index, which is mediated by nutrition knowledge. but the betas here are about half what they were at midline, and so the effect is more modest at inline. Furthermore, there was no longer an effect on household food security, and there was no direct effects at inline either. So I've presented the results for the summary complementary feeding index, but the results were similar for individual complementary feeding practices for minimum meal frequency, portion size, and complementary food thickness. Dietary diversity, however, was a bit different. For dietary diversity score, the indirect effect was mediated through household food security and not nutrition knowledge. And we also saw a direct effect of the full intervention, that is an effect that's not explained by either mediator, at both midline and endline for dietary diversity. So in conclusion, the Quality Diets for Better Health project improved complementary feeding practices, particularly at the midline survey, through a combination of direct effects and indirect effects. The toolkit could act as a valuable cue to action, and in fact, we saw the direct effect from the toolkit group was stronger than the indirect effects. However, the impact of the project was largely not sustained at endline, and why might that be? Our most educated guess, if we think back to the graph of the complementary feeding index, is that caregivers in the full intervention stayed relatively flat from midline to endline, whereas the partial intervention and control groups improved. And so we don't think that caregivers in the full intervention stopped practicing improved complementary feeding, but rather that caregivers in the other two groups improved from midline to endline. And this could be the result of a natural shift as the children get older, or again, because that midline survey was the food insecure season and food security improved at endline. So that's all for this presentation. Thank you for listening.